Robert Inlakesh here for The Last American Vagabond. This is another foreign policy show update. Today's subject is going to be the supposed assassination of a top Quds force of the IRGC, Iranian commander, around the Iraqi-Syrian border area. Now, claims were made, and we're going to go into them, about this alleged attack having taken place. Some claim that this was a drone strike. Some claim that this was done by fighter jets belonging to the US coalition forces in the area. And of course, this is an extremely sensitive issue, as this was claimed to have happened just 2 days after the assassination on Iranian soil in Tehran of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was the #1 scientist in Iran. So to investigate this story and test its authenticity, what we have to do is we have to follow the tracks back to the very beginning, where this story came from, who printed the story first, where these claims came from, and see what basis we're working on here for the story. Did it ever happen? Were the original claims authentic? Are they trustworthy? So what we can do is we can source the origin of this story back to Syrian opposition media, which also developed the story before it went to later on Israeli media, then international media after that. The first agency to report on this was an agency called Step News Agency, a Syrian opposition media organization, of course, which has an anti-Iran agenda, as do most of the opposition media sources. They often present things from the opposite side of what the Syrian government sees the war being inside of Syria. And their reporter, which they claim is named Abdul Rahman Al-Ahmad, was supposedly on the ground in the eastern province of Syria called Deir ez-Zor, and he obtained information, according to them, which indicated a vehicle belonging to Iran's elite Quds Force unit was targeted and destroyed on Sunday. The car was, according to this report, targeted near the Saibi area in the Sawai desert, and after it had crossed into Syria. So they're stating here that this vehicle had crossed into Syria near the Al-Qaim crossing, which is the crossing between Syria and Iraq. In this report, what they had said is that 2 people had died. That was the original report. They were both Iranians. There were no specifics which were actually pointed out in their original reporting. This was later developed by Syrian opposition media, and the story, of course, grew legs. However, we don't have, and this is something from the very start until now, we have no photographic evidence of the event ever occurring. We have no video evidence of the event ever occurring. We have no reports from hospitals of it occurring. We have no reports from official sources on the ground there. The Syrian government, according to contacts I have in the military, do not know of such an attack ever having taken place. And also Iranian sources say that this attack didn't ever take place. Now they've now announced this officially as being essentially propaganda. On top of this as well, we know that there are no official statements from sources in Iraq, sources in Syria, sources in Iran, or anyone else, including the United States or Israel, on this issue. So we have to understand that going forward. This story, however, was picked up by the Israeli media a day later, approximately. And when the Israeli media reported on it, they sourced specifically Israel Hayom, which is a news outlet, an Israeli news outlet, reported and sourced from the news agency I just noted in the beginning, which is where this report seemed to have originated from, Step News Agency. Israel Hayom, however, reported the developed claims that there were in fact 2 Iranians plus an Iranian elite Quds Force member who was also killed in this attack. The allegations at this point seem to suggest that a drone strike had occurred, and that's how this attack was carried out. Later on, a Saudi-owned news outlet, Al Arabiya, reported the name of the supposed Quds Force commander who was killed in action, and they presented his name as being Shahdan. Now, this has not been corroborated by other sources. It was reported upon. However, what we have to do here is we have to look at the origin of this claim and also the track record of Al Arabiya recently. Now, we know Saudi politics and which side of the political spectrum that they sit on. However, Al Arabiya as an outlet has actually been boycotted, for instance, by the Hamas movement in the Gaza Strip after they made up unfounded claims of in Al-Qassam brigades, which is the armed wing of Hamas commander, having deserted to Israel. This was never proven, and Hamas had boycotted the outlet, and many others throughout the region had boycotted the outlet because of such a claim having been made. On top of this as well, what we can draw from this example is that Al Arabiya is fine with making these sort of assertions, naming people, claiming outrageous things which would have big real-world implications without having the sources to back them up, which makes it a problematic source when it comes to naming someone like this at such a time as well. Then we saw that international press had picked up and used the same reference, it seems, as Al Arabiya, naming this Quds Force commander. The likes of the Daily Mail reproduced this name, and of course others did so as well. The Daily Mail went a step further, also quoting Anadolu Agency, which is a Turkish-based media outlet, which claimed that there weren't, now we've gone from, you got to take this into consideration, we've gone from 2 Iranians being killed to 2 Iranians, ordinary Iranians, and a Quds Force commander being killed, the name of that Quds Force commander coming out, and now we have, according to the Turkish news outlet, we have 3 members of Iran's Quds forces inside of a car with an additional Quds Force commander. This was reported by the Daily Mail. They showed depictions of where this possibly took place. At this stage as well, we have to consider that different Syrian opposition groups, medias, and also the media of the Israelis had not delivered a message which would decisively say that the attack had taken place in a certain area. So at this point, people trying to analyze this wouldn't have been able to confirm exactly where this attack took place as the story was changing. However, at this stage, what I want to go back to is the initial report that we looked at, the one that was produced in Step News Agency. Now, this news report had said that there was an attack from coalition forces, likely, which took place last week against 10 Iranian sites around Abu Kamal. Now, what we saw after this, because this report was quoted by Israeli media, is that, for instance, when we go back to the report of Israel Hayom, they seem to state that this attack happened but didn't say the timing of it. Then when we saw this report reproduced again and again, coming back to the Daily Mail story, we saw them produce this report which included the coalition attack, alleged attack on 10 Iranian sites, again not naming exactly when it happened, but putting it in such an order that it looked like there was a large-scale attack which occurred that very same night. A lot of people reading this article, not knowing any better, would assume that that attack happened the same night, that US coalition forces came in and bombed 10 sites belonging to Iran, or Iranian-backed militias as they call them. So this entire story, as it's developed, has been completely problematic. But then the story got a little bit more complex when Al Jazeera Arabic reported that PMU sources, and for those that don't know, the PMU is an official part of the Iraqi armed forces, and some of the different groups which make up the PMU, because of course it's not just one group, it's multiple groups which factor into it, had stated, PMU sources had stated to them that this attack took place and there was a Quds Force commander killed in the attack. However, they did not specify the names of anyone. They couldn't give names. Now, we also saw these claims repeated on RT as well. This is where it was also reproduced. The Al Jazeera claims, for a lot of people, may have seem to have had some authenticity here. And we can't completely brush claims like this off. However, there was no official statement which was released by any of the groups within the PMU. There was no official statement which was released by the Iraqi government or authorities. People had sourced Iraqi officials, they say. They had sourced PMU officials, all unnamed. However, we don't have any proof of this being the case. On top of this, this is a very good time to point out that the PMU is not an Iranian proxy, as they try and present it as being. In fact, many of the groups inside of the PMU, yes, are absolutely sympathetic to Iran. Not only that, but they see Iran as being part of their own cause. However, there are groups within the PMU who are absolutely not with the Iranian government. Many people in different armed groups which do not owe their allegiance to Iran. And this is essential to understand because the PMU is part of the Iraqi armed forces. So the number one allegiance there of the PMU would not be to Iran, it would be to Iraq. That's something that we have to keep in mind and we have to understand. And this Western propaganda that we hear and Israeli propaganda that we hear that the PMU is just one big contiguous bloc which is an Iranian proxy is completely incorrect. Also, a claim that I want to look at here, which went together with the rest of the story that I've just told you about and the different claims that we've heard come forth, is the claim that the car, this is according to Syrian opposition media, was carrying arms at the time. Now, this is a car transporting, reportedly, a Quds Force commander, and depending upon which reports you want to believe, 2, 3, or even 1 passenger that's there with the Quds Force commander in question. They claim that these arms are being transported in the car, but this would make absolutely no sense, especially if you know anything about that area, the Iranian base that's set up in Abu Kamal, and how they usually transport weapons. Such a high-ranking official is carrying weapons in a car which is driving. Nobody said anything about a convoy specifically or said how many cars in that convoy would be involved or anything like this. So we're left to assume this was a single car transporting weapons and traveled from Iraq into Syria, or perhaps was targeted in between during the crossing. Some reports would say that during the time that it was crossing the border, it was struck, that it would be transporting weapons, which seems highly doubtful. On top of this, these Syrian opposition groups have a track record of lying about the results of Israeli and even US airstrikes in Syria. They claim to have sources on the ground basically everywhere in Syria. Now, their claims of how hard the Syrian government clamps down on freedom of speech, if they do have reporters for these media outlets all over the place in Damascus and Deir ez-Zor and elsewhere in government-held areas in Syria, they would debunk their own claims that there's no free journalism in Syria. But of course, that's not what they would come forth and say. They report time and time again with basically every single Israeli airstrike campaign on Syria that Iranians have been killed or Iranian-backed forces have been killed, with no evidence to back it up whatsoever, no sources to name at any time. And they're talking about sensitive positions, alleged positions, top secret positions, in which they would have to have people there on the ground to ID these people. Because these forces that they're claiming, the Iranian forces and Iranian-backed forces, do not operate in a lot of the areas where they're claiming they operate. The intelligence is completely off, and a lot of the time when I know from sources inside of the Syrian air defense that when the Syrian air defenses were targeted, there were Israeli claims of the Iranian-backed militias and Iranians being targeted in these airstrikes when it was purely Syrian air defense. These claims that they come up with are anti-Iran. They are used by the Israeli media. The Israeli media use the claims of the opposition groups in order to push their own agenda. And it would seem like that is a possibility of, it's a very big possibility that that has happened in this case here. Again, to reiterate, there is no photographic video evidence as proof. There's no witness testimony. There is no medical reports. There is no official reports which have came out or statements that have came out saying this happened or naming anyone officially from the Iraqi authorities, the PMU, any of the groups in the PMU, the Syrian government, which controls these areas, by the way. The Syrian government is in control of these areas. Not even the Saudi government has commented, or the Israeli government, or the US government has commented on it. And in fact, the Iranian government has had high-ranking officials come out and dispute this and say that this is basically propaganda as a form of psychological warfare. And at this moment, with days having gone past and absolutely no confirmation of this ever happening, it does look and it does seem like this was perhaps propaganda. Cooked up. Of course, it originated with Syrian opposition media. It was pushed by Israeli media. It was fueled by Saudi media. And it was picked up by basically everybody else as well. So at this point, there is no evidence whatsoever. And in fact, the contradicting stories and claims which have came out is enough actually to assume that the evidence leads you to believe that nothing happened at this point. However, the biggest problem here is that media outlets, including media outlets which are often give favorable coverage to the Iranian government, have reported this in a way where it looks like it is a fact, when it was not a fact. It was not confirmed. And such big media outlets and corporations around the world should have the integrity to do their due diligence and research the issue. It literally takes delving into the websites, delving into the groups, looking up with some sources, and finding any information you can on this. After digging into everything I possibly could on Arabic media and English media, English-speaking media alike, I found nothing. This has been Robert Inlakesh here for the Last American Vagabonds Foreign Policy Show. Until next time.